address, so I will happily skip by it. I can give you some resources if you'd like from the theologians, and we'll look at actually one theologian in a second. Theistic evolutionists, similar to the Old-Earth Creationist approach in that they hold that proper exegesis of Genesis is okay with an old Earth and an old cosmos. They're in the same camp there, no problem there. But they extend that to say, okay, exegesis of the Genesis account isn't at odds with an evolutionary understanding of the origin of life or humanity. In that, they typically bring in nuances of context, the genre of Genesis, and what the original intended audience was supposed to hear from that message that God was giving. So you'll see we're quite a ways away from the young Earth creationist perspective now in terms of how they would deal with Genesis. Theistic evolutionists hold that humans are created in the image of God, and that might sound a little funny if you think about them in terms of accepting evolutionary biology. They hold that humans are the creation of God in His image, that they share ancestry with other forms of life, and that they hold that these views are not in conflict with one another. That humans can be God's creation and the results of a long process of evolution, and that these things aren't in conflict. This is the main dividing line here between, like, terms of sort of Christian approaches to evolution. We've now crossed a line in terms of we are no longer in an anti-evolutionary setting here. We're at the last sort of, we've crossed, in terms of what they accept or reject in terms of theories, we've taken that last one off the list now. So this is what a Christian approach to evolution looks like once you say, okay, evolution's fine. Okay, so here, just to make the point, this isn't in your notes, I don't think, theories rejected or disputed by the theistic evolutionary approach? Well, none at this point. They accept all of what science has to offer and seek to reconcile it with God's revelation through Scripture, on the one hand, God's revelation through nature, on the other hand, and it's an attempt to hold both those in tension, yes, but with equal respect to both, like you've seen in Gordon Glover's introductory lectures that were assigned back at the beginning of the course. Okay. So, theistic evolution has been around since the 1850s. It accepts the scientific evidence for evolutionary theory, all the way up to including the common descent of humans and chimpanzees, which is sort of the key litmus test, really. It holds the belief that evolution is the physical mechanism by which God brought about biodiversity on Earth. And it accepts the authority of the Genesis account in general terms without requiring the interpretation of that passage to hold to a literal interpretation in terms of 6 days, 24-hour periods 6,000 years ago. So, who are promoters of this view? You heard from one of them last class, geneticist Francis Collins, who was the recent head of the Human Genome Project. Kenneth Miller is a cell biologist from Brown University. You would have seen him on the Kitzmiller video because he was one of the lead witnesses for the Kitzmiller case. I think I've mentioned briefly this individual, Simon Conway Morris. He's the chair of evolutionary paleobiology at Cambridge University, and recently wrote a book, or not so recently now, wrote a book called Life's Solution, which is on my reading list. He is very much of the view that convergent evolution speaks against the idea of randomness in the evolutionary process. I think we spoke about this briefly. Basically, convergent evolution is that you see the same sort of things happening through evolution in different places in terms of constraint from the environment. So you end up with animals that look very similar to each other, even though they are arriving at that endpoint through a different ancestry. So the best example of that are the different classes of animals in Australia, for example, all the marsupials. So if you've got the Tasmanian wolf, looks very much like a dog on the outside, but genetically is much, much, much more similar to a kangaroo than it is to a placental dog like we would have here. And the idea there is that Conway Morris is advancing is that if you set up the environment in such a way, organisms will converge in a certain way through evolution to take on a certain predetermined form. You may have heard of Dennis Lamoureux. He's a professor in Canada. He's at a college affiliated with the University of Alberta, and he just wrote a book recently called Evolutionary Creation, which is kind of the go-to book for this view of theistic evolutionists, this whopping great tome of a book that essentially deals with the theology of the situation, not the evolutionary biology. He has the interesting distinction of having 3 graduate degrees. He's a dentist. He has a PhD in evolutionary biology, and he has a PhD in theology. So he's well qualified, and it makes for a good read. Okay. He also is not married and doesn't have a family, and that partially explains it in my mind. Sort of a lifelong scholar. He's an interesting fellow, and I had the privilege of meeting him this past summer and having a good conversation with him, so enjoyed that. Unlike these previous methods that we've looked at of integration, the primary objections to theistic evolution are theological. And the reason for that is that there's no scientific issues really to have issue with, because theistic evolutionists accept evolutionary biology sort of whole cloth. The debate then, of course, centers on interpretation of Genesis. This is now outside of my area of expertise, because I'm not a theologian, although I am a lay theologian and interested amateur of a sort. But in brief, let me say that there's good reason when approaching Genesis, even on its own terms, to come to the conclusion that the original authorial intent of that portion of Scripture was not intended to communicate a 624 or 6,000 type of approach. Here's a fellow by the name of Bruce Waltke. Maybe you've heard of Bruce. He's a professor emeritus from Regent College, which is here in Vancouver. He's a theologian of quite high stature and standing. This is from his recent book, Old Testament Theology, and he has come around to the notion that theistic evolution is actually the best way of putting science and faith together. So he's sort of a recent example, sort of the first big-name theologian really to come to this conclusion. And he specifies in his book that Francis Collins was helpful to him in arriving at this view. I can post some excerpts from that book, and the book is actually in the Trinity Library, so if you want to go look at it, you could. It's this. If you think Dennis Lamoureux's book is big, well, Waltke outdoes Lamoureux by a long shot. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses of theistic evolution as a model for integration. Well, it certainly has a great weakness in that it has very little popular support, very little whatsoever. You will search long and hard to find somebody at the pew level who has adopted this view. And if they have, they will typically not be very vocal about it, at least in evangelical churches.
What about like internationally?
Internationally? In the UK, you would find more, for sure. Young Earth creationism especially started as typically an American, somewhat Canadian, but mostly an American phenomenon. But it's now spread to Australia, the UK, other places. Those ministries are actively seeking new adherents in those areas. So, whereas before, if you were sort of just your average Anglican in the UK in the past 20 years, you would typically be some sort of theistic evolutionist of a sort, or you wouldn't really just care about it very much. It wouldn't be an issue for you. Yeah. Wouldn't be. There's not really the culture warfare kind of model in those places that there is in the United States. You certainly wouldn't find somebody advocating to get it into a school to teach it, although we're starting to see that now in the UK and in Australia as well. The other weakness, of course, is that it raises some challenging theological issues. I've only sort of glossed over them, but they are there, and they can be more challenging to some than others. It depends on, in some ways, it depends on how committed you are to one of the previous creationist positions before you get should you get dislodged into this view of thinking. If you accept that the evidence for evolutionary biology is quite good, well then how do you start to put that together theologically? Well, The church has been through that before. We talked a bit about